"It is something that you have never even dreamt about," replied the wild geese. "Now we must think out what we shall do with Thumbietot to morrow, so that no harm can come to him while we run over to Kullaberg," said Akka. "Thumbietot shall not be left alone," said the goosey gander. "If the cranes won't let him see their dance, then I'll stay with him." "No human being has ever been permitted to attend the animals' congress at Kullaberg," said Akka, "and I shouldn't dare to take Thumbietot along. But we'll discuss this more at length later in the day. Now we must first and foremost think about getting something to eat." With that Akka gave the signal to adjourn. On this day she also sought her feeding place a good distance away, on Smirre Fox's account, and she didn't alight until she came to the swampy meadows a little south of Glimminge castle. All that day the boy sat on the shores of a little pond, and blew on reed pipes. He was out of sorts because he shouldn't see the crane dance, and he just couldn't say a word, either to the goosey gander or to any of the others. It was pretty hard that Akka should still doubt him. When a boy had given up being human just to travel around with a few wild geese, they surely ought to understand that he had no desire to betray them. Then, too, they ought to understand that when he had renounced so much to follow them, it was their duty to let him see all the wonders they could show him. "I'll have to speak my mind right out to them," thought he. But hour after hour passed; still he hadn't come round to it. It may sound remarkable, but the boy had actually acquired a kind of respect for the old leader goose. He felt that it was not easy to pit his will against hers. On one side of the swampy meadow, where the wild geese fed, there was a broad stone hedge. Toward evening, when the boy finally raised his head to speak to Akka, his glance happened to rest on this hedge. He uttered a little cry of surprise, and all the wild geese instantly looked up and stared in the same direction. At first both the geese and the boy thought that all the round, gray stones in the hedge had acquired legs, and were starting on a run. But soon they saw that it was a company of rats who ran over it. They moved very rapidly, and ran forward, tightly packed, line upon line, and were so numerous that for some time they covered the entire stone hedge. The boy had been afraid of rats, even when he was a big, strong human being. Then what must his feelings be now, when he was so tiny that two or three of them could overpower him? One shudder after another travelled down his spinal column as he stood and stared at them. But strangely enough the wild geese seemed to feel the same aversion toward the rats that he did. They did not speak to them, and when they were gone, they shook themselves as if their feathers had been mud spattered. "Such a lot of gray rats abroad," said Iksi from Vassijaure. "That's not a good omen." The boy intended to take advantage of this opportunity to say to Akka that he thought she ought to let him go with them to Kullaberg, but he was prevented anew, for all of a sudden a big bird came down in the midst of the geese. One could believe, when one looked at this bird, that he had borrowed body, neck, and head from a little white goose. But in addition to this, he had procured for himself large black wings, long red legs, and a thick bill, which was too large for the little head, and weighed it down until it gave him a sad and worried look. Akka at once straightened out the folds of her wings, and curtsied many times as she approached the stork. She wasn't specially surprised to see him in Skåne so early in the spring, because she knew that the male storks are in the habit of coming in good season to take a look at the nest and see that it hasn't been damaged during the winter, before the female storks go to the trouble of flying over the East sea. But she wondered very much what it might signify that he sought her out, since storks prefer to associate with members of their own family. "I can hardly believe that there is anything wrong with your house, Herr Ermenrich," said Akka. It was apparent now that it is true what they say: a stork can seldom open his bill without complaining. But what made the thing he said sound even more doleful was that it was difficult for him to speak out. He stood for a long time and only clattered with his bill. Afterward he spoke in a hoarse and feeble voice. He complained about everything. The nest, which was situated at the very top of the roof tree at Glimminge castle, had been totally destroyed by winter storms, and no food could he get any more in Skåne. The people of Skåne were appropriating all his possessions. They dug out his marshes and laid waste his swamps. He intended to move away from this country and never return to it again. While the stork grumbled, Akka, the wild goose, who had neither home nor protection, could not help thinking to herself: "If I had things as comfortable as you have, Herr Ermenrich, I should be above complaining. You have remained a free and wild bird, and still you stand so well with human beings that no one will fire a shot at you, or steal an egg from your nest." But all this she kept to herself. To the stork she only remarked that she couldn't believe he would be willing to move from a house where storks had resided ever since it was built. Then the stork suddenly asked the geese if they had seen the gray rats who were marching toward Glimminge castle. When Akka replied that she had seen the horrid creatures, he began to tell her about the brave black rats who for years had defended the castle. "But this night Glimminge castle will fall into the gray rats' power," sighed the stork. "And why just this night, Herr Ermenrich?" asked Akka. "Well, because all the black rats went over to Kullaberg last night," said the stork, "since they had counted on all the rest of the animals also hurrying there. But you see that the gray rats have stayed at home, and now they are mustering to storm the castle to night, when it will be defended by only a few old creatures, who are too feeble to go over to Kullaberg. They'll probably accomplish their purpose. But I have lived here in harmony with the black rats for so many years, that it does not please me to live in a place inhabited by their enemies." Akka understood now that the stork had become so enraged over the gray rat's mode of action that he had sought her out as an excuse to complain about them. But after the manner of storks, he certainly had done nothing to avert the disaster. "Have you sent word to the black rats, Herr Ermenrich?" she asked. "No," replied the stork. "That wouldn't be of any use. Before they can get back, the castle will be taken." "You mustn't be so sure of that, Herr Ermenrich," said Akka. "I know an old wild goose, I do, who will gladly prevent outrages of this kind." When Akka said this, the stork raised his head and stared at her. And it was not surprising, for Akka had neither claws nor bill that were fit for fighting, and in the bargain she was a day bird, and as soon as it grew dark she fell helplessly asleep, while the rats did their fighting at night. But Akka had evidently made up her mind to help the black rats. She called Iksi from Vassijaure and ordered him to take the wild geese over to the Vomb lake, and then the geese made excuses. She said authoritatively: "I believe it will be best for us all that you obey me. I must fly over to the big stone house, and if you follow me, the people on the place will be sure to see us and shoot us down. The only one that I want to take with me on this trip is Thumbietot. He can be of great service to me because he has good eyes, and can keep awake at night." The boy was in his most contrary mood that day, and when he heard what Akka said, he raised himself to his full height and stepped forward. his hands behind him and his nose in the air, and he intended to say that he, most assuredly, did not wish to take a hand in the fight with gray rats. She might look